The Trending Cycles is a entity we've formed that is devoted to the interface of system dynamics and economics. It's going to have an electronic presence with a YouTube channel, a Thinkific course website where we'll offer courses, and a regular website at which we will host all sorts of quote unquote premium events. So the YouTube channel could be monetized and what have you, but basically it's a marketing entity. We're going to be posting our first nuts and bolts, how do I do it system dynamics course on YouTube, and it'll be for free. And it will also contain other interesting videos. There's a few things up there right now we haven't really got rolling yet. But people who find it interesting will be directed to our Thinkific course site. And that's a place at which we'll offer an entire collection of self-paced system dynamics classes and system dynamics and economics classes. So if you just want to learn how to do system dynamics, the nuts and bolts of how do I do it, there'll be a course sequence there. And if you want to learn about the economics and system dynamics interface, there'll be those classes there as well. The classes will be modestly priced so that they're available to everybody. You got to pay a little bit. We got to pay the bills. You got to, there's these sites charge fees and stuff. But the first course that will be on YouTube will also be in Thinkific, but now it's an official course. It'll still be free, but you got to give us your name and contact information. And then you'll have access to all the PowerPoint slides and models and stuff like that. And you have the opportunity to earn a badge. A badge is an electronic credential, right, that links to a server that says so-and-so has, we certify has learned the following stuff, right, by completing this course. And a badge is a prerequisite for the next course. So you can't take the second How Do I Do It System Dynamics course until you have a badge from the first course and so forth. If you have enough badges, you're going to be eligible to become a premium member of our regular website, our traditional website. And we found over years of teaching system dynamics that it's possible to get somebody from zero to sort of the intermediate level of system dynamics modeling through what I just described. Watching lectures, either live or recorded, homework assignments, quizzes, stuff like that. But to get to the sort of PhD professional level requires mentorship. So if you earn the right number of badges, you'll be eligible to become a premium member at our website. And that's a place where there'll be advanced material. There'll be live streams where you can come when it's live and ask questions. The recorded version will then go to the YouTube site later, but things like that. But also you'll be able to book time with senior modelers, where you'll be able to get yourself from the intermediate level to the expert level. I define the intermediate level of modeling acumen as someone who can build a model from scratch that's technically correct, just not very insightful. It's not counterintuitive. You kind of know what it's going to do before you press the simulation button, right? A good system, and it often has just one behavior mode or two behavior modes. A sort of a level system dynamics model is counterintuitive. You don't necessarily know what it's going to do through mental simulation on any given simulation run, any change. And there's no preordained solutions typically. It can generate all sorts of behaviors. You don't know which. And that often takes somebody who has more experience to look at your model and say, what are you trying to do here? Let me offer a suggestion. And of course, we have the additional challenge of whatever we do, we want economists to be comfortable with what's happening and vice versa. So that's the big picture. So let me circle then over to what I mean by economics and system dynamics more specifically. Okay, what is the question? Can economic modeling and policy analysis be done with system dynamics in a manner that will be deemed acceptable to both system dynamicists and economists? In red, that's the biggie, right? So, the very first paper in our field of system dynamics is in our D-Memo collection, right? Forrester knew he was creating a new field of human inquiry, so he insisted that they document everything, both good and bad. So there'd be a history of the field. And if, something seemed like a good idea and it wasn't, there'd be a record of it so that somebody else wouldn't go down that path and hit a dead end and what have you. So the very first D memo, D000 or D0, is for the first paper in our field in 1956. And it's Forrester's sort of attack on economic modeling. He basically says, if you read the D memo, like, well, I'm an engineer due to this. I've been reading the economics literature and the modeling, literature and whatever, and it kind of is lacking. He says it politely, and he kind of says, I'm new, so maybe I haven't read everything, but he really is taking a shot at the economists. And then he says later in his memo, like, here's what you should be doing, which is, of course, system dynamics, right? That D memo was largely ignored by economists. The only people who'd really see it were MIT economists, but we're not talking minor league baseball there, but they didn't really have much to say about it. So, all right. So Forrester goes about his business for the next 15 years or so doing corporate modeling. And then he did his famous urban dynamics stuff when John Collins, the former mayor of Boston, happened to be given an office next to him. And Collins asked him, well, if you can model a company, can you model a city? So the urban dynamics thing happened. And now Forrester's playing in the sandbox of urban and regional economics, a subdiscipline of economics. And that got attention, and it was controversial. And Jay spent a lot of time defending it. For example, why aren't there any suburbs in your model? Well, I didn't think there needed to be any for the problem the model was. But all right, let's have somebody, a master's student, put the suburbs in and whatever. So, he had to do a lot of responding to the critics, many of whom were economists. But it really didn't get the attention of the economics profession until a year or so later, when the Club of Rome asked him to look at the world problematique, or the predicament of mankind. And he wrote the book World Dynamics, followed by, of course, The Limits to Growth. And that got the attention of the economics profession. And it was really nasty business from that point forward. Because now we're in the macroeconomics sandbox. And what Forrester was showing, and Meadows et al. Later, was at odds with the traditional story in economic growth theory anyway, right? Is this idea of unlimited exponential growth, where technology always saves us and the carrying capacity of the global system always is ahead of the demands on it, and so forth, all that stuff. So in the mid-1970s, Forrester and his group reached the conclusion that economists don't like system dynamics. And Jay always said he was terribly surprised. He thought they would think it was interesting. He didn't anticipate that economists would be so hostile to what he was doing. Of course, the next thing his next project after the world modeling stuff was the system dynamics national model. So as long as he's playing in the macro sandbox, let's go all in, right? And his national model generated a Kondratiev cycle, which, at least in the United States, was seen to be a peculiarity or non-existent. Schumpeter talked a little bit about it, but really it was seen as sort of a weird thing and nothing to write home about. It also had big implications. If the economic long wave is a repetitive cycle of some 60, 70 years, 50 to 70 years, depending on government intervention, then the Great Depression, let's say, was not a one-time unusual circumstance that happened before we had macroeconomics, but it's a recurring feature of capitalist systems. So there was a bigger picture objection to Jay's work as well, okay? So in the early 80s, when I came into the picture, most system dynamics, as you see here, felt that economists believe system dynamics is illegitimate and has no place in the economics profession, or some, that would have been even the economists who had heard of it. A lot of economists didn't even hear about it. All right, so now I'm a student. So in some sense, this is a little bit of my personal story. And I was a second-year graduate student at the time, and we had to take a mandatory class. And it was taught by this guy, Chuck Wilbur. I had met Chuck Wilbur, but I didn't really know him. And we were in the library, one of the libraries on campus, on like the 12th floor, in some conference room. There may be a dozen or so PhD students in economics. And this is a required class. I didn't really know what it was about, but okay, we got to take it. Here we are. And in walks Chuck Wilbur on the first day. And we're all sitting around the table, chit-chatting, as fellow students do. And Chuck walks to the front of the room, and there was a table there with one of these little lectern things on it. And he was carrying a giant pile of books and papers and things. He was one of these guys who assigned 7 books during the semester and brought the book in on the first day. He said, you're going to read this one, and you're going to read this one. So he had this giant pile, and we're and he walks up to the front and takes the giant pile and just drops it, and it goes bang and hits the big table with a big thud. And we all stop and we look up, and he grabs the little lectern thing and he leans out over it and he says to us, how do you know if an explanation for something is true? First words out of his mouth. And I was like, you didn't even give us the syllabus yet, and you're starting in on us. And a moment later, I said to myself, that's a really good question. How do you know if an explanation for something is true? Why is there lightning? Okay, well, obviously, thunder and lightning are in Greek mythology are caused by Zeus, right? He was able to harness the elements elements in the sky to use as a weapon. And he was the ruler of all the Olympian gods. And when he was angry, he would throw bolts and so forth. Okay, that's one explanation. Well, how do you know if that's true? Right? Socrates is attributed as saying that's not Zeus up there, it's a vortex of air during a thunderstorm. Well, if you go to this link I have down here, this is a New World Encyclopedia, you'll find that even today there's controversy among scientists as to exactly what causes lightning. Another one that's quite famous, do we orbit the sun or does the sun orbit us? Aristotle said the sun orbits the earth. Tycho Brahe made the precise measurements, but he also thought the sun orbited the earth. Copernicus said, no, other way around. Earth orbits the sun, but it's a circle. Kepler said, no, it's an ellipse. And Galileo got in big trouble because he had a telescope and he was confirming what Copernicus and Kepler were saying. Right? So again, there's controversies about, if you will, the theory, or why do we unite into day into night? Why is that happening? Right. More recently, just a week or so ago, I got an email message. I'm a ham radio operator, and one of the hams was pointing out that there are 2 competing theories now about the origin of sunspots and the sunspot cycle. Sunspots influence the Earth's atmosphere, which influence the ability of ham radio operators to bounce their signals around the Earth. So that's what they care about it. But again, here in 2022, there are competing explanations for why things happen. So how do you know if an explanation for something is true? Well, what we found out in Chuck's course is there were actually schools of thought in economics. So what we mean by schools of thought is that these are economists who do economics the same way. They attend the same conferences, they write for and read from the same journals. They train doctoral students and swap them among themselves and what have you. So at one point years ago, I was trying to map out who influenced who. I started at the top of this hard to read figure here with old Adam Smith at the top here. There's actually Kine is over here as well, a physiocrat. And we go to Malthus, and all the way down at the bottom here, we have schools of thought. And there's all sorts of schools of thought that I identify, right? So these are economists who, they're not literally at the same physical place, but they know one another and they do economics the same way. And they do economics differently from other schools of thought. Well, as an undergrad economics major, I just learned whatever I was taught and spit it back on exams. And I did it well, and I got an A, and I said, I can do this. Why don't I become an economist, right? I was shocked to find out there's schools of thought, and they disagree. They don't do economics the same way. Well, this is not a philosophy of science lecture, and even if it was, I'd be the wrong person to teach it. So let me give you my very amateur level quick version of this, how do economists explain things? What's the difference? It's actually scientists in general, but that's what Chuck Wilbur was teaching us. It was a philosophy of science course. How do scientists explain generally, and then how do economists explain things? In some sense, it could be boiled down simplistically to Descartes versus Hume. Descartes on the left, Hume is on the right. Rene Descartes, if you draw a graph, that's a Cartesian plane, right? Descartes felt that you explain properly with deductive logic. You start with the mind and you have a logical explanation, a logical theory from your head. Today we'd use math to represent it, right? And then from that logical theory or explanation, you derive a testable hypothesis. And then and only then do you go take measurements from the real world. You observe the real world and see if the measurements confirm the theory or not. If not, the theory is wrong or the measurements are bad. Now you get into a little more subtlety, but at any rate, deductive logic. Most orthodox or traditionally trained economists do science, do economics like Descartes using deductive logic. But there are economists and other schools of thought that use inductive logic. They followed David Hume. Hume said, no, 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 it's the opposite. You start with the real world. You start observing the real world and you look for patterns or regularities. It's called pattern modeling. If you find commonalities in the patterns, those are collected in what they would call real typologies or real types. And then if there's commonalities among the real types, those are principles of economics. So you start with the real world and build your way up to theory. Whereas with deductive logic and Descartes, you start with theory and work your way down to the real world. Obviously, these are two different ways of approaching things, okay? So these schools of economists are not going to do economics the same way, and they're not necessarily going to agree with one another. Here's what I just said in more formal language and some links and things. If you want to look at the Descartesian deductive logic approach to explaining things formally, this is the kind of thing the philosophers of science would say. There's these general laws and antecedent conditions from which you derive your testable hypothesis. It's just a more formal way of saying what I just said. Let me give you an example. So macroeconomics was started by a guy named John Maynard Keynes, right, in 1936. Now, Keynes was not setting out to create macroeconomics. Instead, he was alarmed by the Great Depression in the UK, the Great Slump, right? And the economics he had been taught as a student basically said that involuntary unemployment was a short-run thing because markets would correct. Adam Smith's invisible hand would come into action. And if you have a surplus of turnips, the markets for turnips would reduce the turnips price and there'd be a sale on turnips and the market would clear. And so similarly, if you had excess labor, the labor market would reduce wages, money wages anyway, and firms would start hiring again at the cheaper price and the labor market would clear. And that didn't seem to be happening, right? Because the Great Depression lasted a decade. Every day Keynes looks outside his window and says, ah, it's still here. So he said, there's got to be a different explanation for things. So he came up with a different explanation. He wrote it up in a book called The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, or simply The General Theory. And along the way, he created what we don't know today as macroeconomics. So it offered an explanation for why there was a Great Depression and you know what to do to get out of it. Okay. Now, by the way, why do we have macroeconomics? Just as an aside, it's the fallacy of composition. If you attribute what is true for a part of the system to the system as a whole, that is a logical fallacy. And the famous example he offered was the paradox of thrift. If I save more for my retirement, or you save more for a new car or something, or a down payment on a house, whatever, that's a good thing. But if everybody saves more, it's bad because it throws the economy into a recession. That's the kind of thing. So you have to look at the big, at the big picture, right? That's why we have macroeconomics. So in his book, Keynes says, all right, my whole theory, my whole edifice is based on a fundamental psychological law. So he has all this verbiage here. I'm not going to read it to you. The General Theory is a kind of a hard book to read. You got to read it kind of carefully. But basically he's saying, look, everything is based on this paragraph here. So what does he say in this paragraph? We won't read it. We'll just go over. I'll tell you what he said. There's basically two ideas in his fundamental psychological law. The first one is that as income increases, the amount of spending by the household sector increases. So when the household sector has more to spend, it spends more. As Y goes up, C goes up. C is consumption spending. That's spending by the household sector. In the early days of economics, economists built little simple corn models with a quill pen on a scroll. They didn't have computers. So their little economies had one good corn, right? And you could either save the corn or not eat it, not consume it, and then invest it by planting it to make more corn for the future, or you could eat the corn or consume it, right? So that's where that comes from. But anyway, so as Y goes up, as the household sector has more income, it consumes more, or spends more. Okay. On the other hand, as income goes up in the household sector, the fraction of its income that it spends goes down. In other words, the fraction of its income that it saves goes up. Makes sense. If you're richer, you can save more. If you're poorer, you got to spend every dime on food, shelter, whatever, right? But as you have more, you can save more. So let's turn this into math. That's what economists like to do. Well, here's the Keynesian consumption function in the simplest case that describes the spending and really the saving behavior of the household sector, and is a picture of Keynes's fundamental psychological law. When Y goes up, C goes up, so the consumption function, it's a linear function, is upward sloping. The slope is positive, the rise over the run, first derivative, right? And this fraction thing, C over Y, that is the slope of this ray from the origin to any point on the consumption function. So C over Y, that's the fraction of income spent. As Y goes up, the ray gets flatter, or the slope gets smaller, right? So a Keynesian consumption function that conforms to this or this has to look like this. It can't come out of the origin, and it can't strike the origin below zero, right? So that's theory. Keynes says here, he's basically saying, with great confidence from a priori knowledge of human nature, he says, in my mind, Descartes, I know this to be true, right? And here's a mathematical, albeit simple picture of what he said. All right, so that's the theory. Now we go, as a Descartesian would say, let's go to the videotape. Let's go to the real world and take some measurements on Y and see what we get. Well, here the Bureau of Economic Analysis did this, right? Here's C and here's Y for the US, and it's upward sloping. Good. That's the theory. That's the real world. Well, what's the problem? Note that the intercept term here is negative. It's kind of hard to see in the picture, but it's striking below the origin. So the slope of this ray is going to get steeper, right, rather than flatter. So it doesn't conform to Keynes. So this can't be right, at least according to this evidence. Of course, if you take cross-sectional data, it does conform to Keynes. So that's a famous Keynesian consumption function controversy. And it was resolved with more sophisticated consumption function theories. Milton Friedman presented one, Franco Modigliani presented another one. They resulted in Nobel Prizes. But that's just an example of how the orthodox economists, the Descartesians, would behave. Notice that's not system dynamics or anything really approaching system dynamics. All right, how about heterodox economists, the David Hume folks? Well, you're supposed to, if you're following that way of doing economics, you're kind of like a detective at a crime scene or a physician examining a new patient. There's a problem here, a crime, a disease, or whatever. You're trying to figure out what's going on. You're trying to explain what's happening here. Okay, so this is why Forster, by the way, always said, system dynamics should not be considered a science, even though it's using math and so forth, but rather a profession like medicine and law. And he felt that economics should be exactly the same, regarded as a profession, not as a science. Okay, so this is more of what a professional would do, a physician would do, for example. So a pattern model is when the detective or the physician is looking at a problem and trying to piece together what's happened. Okay, so it's utilizing sort of a case study approach. You tell a story about what's happened, and you have clues. either the physician is looking at your blood work or whatever, or the detective is seeing clues at the scene of the crime and trying to pull them together into a coherent whole or explanation. So the pieces and how they link together in a story or pattern is the pattern model. So it's really using a systems approach, kind of a case study approach. And again, I mentioned that commonalities, if there's different patients or different crime scenes and you see the same things, you collect those into real typologies. And if there's any, of course, commonalities there, those are the principles of systems. Okay, so I'm not going to read every bullet point here, but let me flash ahead here real quick and then I'll return. So here's lay this out both for heterodox economics and system dynamics. Okay, so notice that not only are the real types and principles accumulated, but they're used at the next crime scene or when evaluating another new patient. You don't do it in a vacuum, right? You have some guidance from these commonalities and patterns and things. Okay. According to Chuck Wilber in his class, the most important principle of economics was circular and cumulative causation. And that was put forth by Gunnar Myrdal, and he won the Nobel Prize in economics for coming up with that concept and applying it to developing nations. Okay, more recently, economists have come up with stock flow consistent modeling. Okay, now let me jump back here before I get more into the system dynamics. So an example of a traditional pattern model, without talking about system dynamics yet, would be by heterodox economics, or those would be accepted by heterodox economists would be the Harvard case study approach. So a classic example is People Express Airline. It's a microeconomics example, right? And here is literally from the Harvard Business School's website. You can buy the case, and it goes into vast detail about the rise and fall of People Express Airlines. At the more macro level, I guess I'd select something you might be familiar with, John Kenneth Galbraith's The Affluent Society, and then his sequel, The New Industrial State, where he describes in sort of a pattern modeling manner modern industrial economies. Okay. When heterodox economists talk about some of these concepts like circular and cumulative causation, what they mean is positive feedback loops and path dependency. And many of you have seen the classic Polya process. It's in John Sturman's book. I just reproduced it here, where you conceive of a vase or a clear jar, and it starts with one black and one white stone in it. And then there's a rule. You generate a random number from a uniform distribution. And if the random number is less than the fraction white, you add a white stone. So you're starting with 50-50. So if the random number is less than 0.5, you add a white stone. Now there's two white stones and one black stone, right? And then you do it again. And you can see I ran the model 6 times here. You get all different results for the percentage of stones that are white. It's kind of like a parfait, right? And if you run it like 100,000 times, you see almost any result is possible. It depends on what path you're directed down. And heterodox economists like to talk about technological lock-in to inferior technologies like QWERTY keyboards and VHS VCRs and stuff like that. But the bigger point is, to heterodox economists, history matters. You can't just blow off history, right? We're here today because of stuff that's happened in the past. Orthodox economists focus on feedback loops too. They might not explicitly do that, but Adam Smith's invisible hand, as you all probably know, is the traditional supply and demand relationship, and those are negative loops, right? Whereas a speculative bubble would be an example of a positive feedback loop, right? And so it's not like orthodox economists are unaware of circular and cumulative causation, right? But they just look at it perhaps in a different manner. All right, so, and then I mentioned the stock flow consistent modeling. We're going to return to that in just a minute. So if you talk to people like Steve Keen and Mark Lavoie, so here we are, Mark Lavoie is over here and Steve Keen is over here. Mark Lavoie is one of the fathers of stock flow consistent modeling. He works in discrete time with difference equations. Steve Keen, you might have heard of Steve. He's an economist from Australia. He has his Minsky software. He works in continuous time. Both of them believe that system dynamics is a good thing, but they don't use system dynamics. When you talk to them about how they do modeling, how they teach modeling, it's amazing. They're doing system dynamics. They just don't do system dynamics. Wynne Godley also was a colleague of Mark Lavoie's, but he's passed away, so we can't really appeal to him anymore. But to give you an example here, so we can take Godley and Lavoie's stuff. Here's right out of this book. This is the Bible of stock flow consistent modeling. This is a model in the third chapter of their book. This is how I learned it. And we'll skip that for a minute. You can translate it into system dynamics, focusing on the feedback loops. When you show this to Mark, he's like, we don't think about even their own models in terms of feedback loops or feedback loop dominance, but you can reproduce all of their stuff, right? Now notice, even though he's working in discrete time, his graphs are smooth and mine are, using difference equations. So he and I have begun a conversation about why is that? What are we doing here? That I think mine is a better way to do it, a more accurate way of doing it. At any rate, so what am I, so who are these heterodox economists and who should we be talking to and what should trending cycles be working towards in terms of attracting people to its site? Well, what I used to tell Forrester was, it's not that all economists hate system dynamics. Some economists hate it. You've got to talk to the right economists. And if you look at some of Jay's later lectures on the national model, he's starting to say that. He bought into what I was saying. Who are these economists or what schools of thought are they in? Well, I got a little list here. Institutional economists, post-Keynesian economists, evolutionary economists, ecological economics, which is different from environmental economics, behavioral and experimental economics. I think that's a cutting edge where we can start creating new molecules representing actual human decision-making as discovered by behavioral and experimental economists. They also work in discrete time, right? So we have to have conversations with them as to why that's the case, and is that a good idea, or we're indifferent between continuous time and discrete time, or what have you. History of economic thought. I do a lot with taking, what did so-and-so say, and let's turn it into a system dynamics model. Maybe they didn't use math, right? And then being able to simulate Adam Smith or whatever. And in some cases, development economics. Development economists are more open, I found, to alternative techniques, as they found that just plopping a regression into a problem in a developing nation doesn't necessarily get you to a solution. All right, so there's different ways that system dynamics can be applied to economic problems. I mentioned you can build models of written theories. Whoever the great thinker was, they didn't use math. You can build models of static theories. The thinking long ago was that why would we expect somebody to study calculus and differential or difference equations before they take an economics class, intro to economics? You'll get nobody in the class, right? So, economists develop static models, which are still widely used today, right? Well, what if you take their static models and make them dynamic? What happens now? Well, a lot of times I found you reveal all sorts of interesting peculiarities in the models that are kind of hidden when you have comparative statics. So you have an equilibrium and then another equilibrium, and what happens in between the equilibria is not known. There's some simple cases with Samuelson's correspondence principle where you can kind of say it's irrelevant, but in most instances, all the interesting stuff happens out of equilibrium. I showed you a Godley and Lavoie model just a minute ago that I reproduced using difference equations. We can do that. And then, of course, there are models presented in continuous time, Steve Keen's models with differential equations. So we can represent those. But really, we want to start building our own original models, because you find a lot of times when you reproduce these models, these sometimes very famous models, they're quite lacking, at least from a system dynamics point of view. Now, we cut these people a lot of slack because they did it without system dynamics. They did it long ago, what have you. So, it is what it is, right? But through modern eyes, really after you understand what others have done, you can kind of say, we can do better. We can do an original model, perhaps from scratch. That's better. So some questions that we're hoping to answer as we go along here. Trending cycles. This wraps my talk up here. What's the best practice for building a system dynamics model of a problem being experienced by an economic system? So, for example, Wynne Godley and Mark Lavoie insist, and the Stockflow consistent modelers insist on a Godley matrix with all of their models. We don't do Godley matrices. Maybe we should. Are any existing economic models wrong or misleading when examined from a dynamic feedback perspective? I kind of said that a minute ago. It's kind of fun to find that out. The paradox of thrift, if you program that up from its static to its dynamic format, you get a very different sort of opinion on that. How can we enrich a system dynamics model with insights from behavioral and experimental economics? Those folks have done a lot of work in controlled settings, and they can tell you, here's what people do when they make their economic decisions. They anchor and adjust. They have short-run bias. They use prospect theory and attach way more utility to not losing $100 than they do to winning $100, et cetera, et cetera. And we're starting at WPI to program that stuff up and look at it from both its original discrete perspective and its continuous brother's perspective. This whole discrete time versus continuous time thing, does it matter? Does the particular representation of time matter? And if it matters, when is it proper to use discrete time modeling? And when is it proper to use continuous time modeling? Are blended discrete time and continuous time models okay? And if so, what is the best practice for creating them? And can you turn a discrete time model into its equivalent continuous time representation? How do you do that? And do you get the same results? Okay. I guess I had another couple of slides here. So what can be learned from conceptualizing economics models from a feedback perspective? Economists don't really do that, right? The stock flow consistent, they think about stocks and flows. They don't often think about feedback loops like we do. How can serious games based on system dynamics models be used to help economic policymakers reach a consensus? What schools of thought, as I mentioned, blend nicely? How would a system dynamicist do microeconomics? You can sort of redo traditional microeconomics, but really, Forrester suggested a different approach. His corporate modeling was really a system dynamics approach to microeconomics, designing and redesigning institutions. And think about that People Express airline. It's a micro model, right? Don Burr, the CEO of People Express, played the People Express flight simulator, said it was the best explanation he had seen of what actually happened at People Express, right? So maybe that we can redo microeconomics following that perspective. And I just got a little macro model here that I'm working on. And a few people mentioned our book, Feedback Economics, where we tried to make a beginning with all of this stuff, okay? So I will leave it there. That's enough of me blathering on. And I'll stop sharing. And we got, I don't know, 10 minutes or something. And we can answer questions or have a conversation about trending cycles.
Hello, I've got a question if I can step in.
Sure.
Okay, super. When Keynes, because it created a bit of an earthquake, in the economics profession, what he did was he killed Say's law. With Say's law being that the production of a good would generate its own supply, and what he was showing that in complex systems, with complex behaviors and feedback loops that didn't necessarily apply. And as a sort of a point of discussion, which bit of the linear model could we have a go at attempting to disprove, from a theoretical basis? Because the toolkit is tremendous. The question is, what's the underlying theory that is explicated? That's the strength of the standard model, isn't it? Is that there is a, however much you believe it. Anyway, to cut to the chase, comparative advantage. Can we find a way to go after comparative advantage? Because in principle, it's one of the strongest arguments of the standard model, and is something that should be able to be undercut with a feedback economics experiment, essentially, or a theoretical experiment. Anyway, that's because what we're really talking about is revolution, isn't it? Or within the the field of standard economics. So how, other than to target the heterodox and to stay on the margins, as it were, what are your thoughts about trying to tackle
Well, I think to some degree the standard international trade model has been undercut by Romer's work and the economics of ideas and rivalrous versus non-rivalrous goods. You can I can use a piece of software at the same time you're using it, right? And so you get increasing returns to scale and all that sort of stuff, which is a positive loop. But you're right. I think we need more work in this area. I found that a good place to start is to replicate an existing well-known thing, right? Hexarolin or whatever the thing is you're looking at, and then say, all right, from our perspective, what's a little strange here or unrealistic or what have you, and let's one by one start to relax a few of these things and make it more realistic. It's still a model, it's not real, but and you begin to you kind of see that some of those famous things are quite a special case of a much richer picture of what's going on. And so, yeah, I mean, by all means, there, you have the old a triangle about the impossible trilemma, right? A nation can have to pick two of the three things that can control its exchange rate, it can control its interest rates, and it can have the free flow of capital. Pick two of three, right? And to look at how different regimes like that influence the idea of comparative advantage. For example, that would be an interesting dissertation or research project. So somebody just has to do it. You got to know enough system dynamics so a professional system dynamics person can look at it and say, you're fine here, there's no problems. And you've got to have enough econ in there where an economist says, well, what about it's in there. Okay, you covered all the econ bases. And now when you run the simulation, whatever happens, happens, right? It's mercilessly carrying out the assumptions and whatever. So, yeah.
I confess that while he was speaking, there was a model of economy in this little very short, but the paper itself was the model of economy in a very short paper, very modern paper, which, if you like, proved it. I'll try and dig it, and I might share it with you after the event. See if we've got any thoughts about how to tackle it directly. Yeah,
sure. So yeah, but I think absolutely. But obviously, there's like a gazillion things to do. So people got to find their niche, right, and do their thing in their niche. But you got to have the right. This is what trending. So we're trying to make sure people are armed with the knowledge to do it, right? So that when you go to an economics conference, people are impressed, not saying, "Oh, this stinks," because you didn't cover this base, or you're unfamiliar with that, or what have you, right? So.
Just going back to the general topic, Mike, is the summary position that if we approach economic modelling and we concentrate on doing something like stock flow consistent modelling, we're going in, that's the way to go. That's what Mark Lavoie is suggesting in this book, that if we go that way, then that's the way to secure that confidence and that validation from other economists.
Right. And if you talk to Mark, you'll say, well, how do you teach it? And he describes it. It sounds like he's teaching a system dynamics class. Oh, we put it in equilibrium, we shock it out, we look at, it's like, well, we do that too. He just rolls in discrete time. And we haven't had the opportunity yet to go through in a detail, like, why is that a good idea? Is it a good idea? Maybe it's a great idea. Maybe we should go to discrete time. I don't think so, but I don't want to just say to these guys and gals, look, we have the answer, you're wrong. That's a very bad way to, that's not good. You got to say, let's work together and let's talk about it and let's figure some stuff out. And it might not be as black and white. I mean, it might be under certain circumstances, it's okay. And other, Michael Kletsky had a famous model from the 1930s that was a mixed continuous and discrete time model. Basically, he had a pipeline continuous time model. But, that had elements of both, right? So those are the kinds of conversations we need to have at Trending Cycles or some such place like Trending Cycles.
If I can make a comment here, I think continuous modeling is much better than discrete time modeling, except that in real world, some things also happen in discrete time. For instance, salaries are paid monthly, and people do not spend it at the spot. So there's time delays in between. So if you do good continuous time modeling, you still have to make these time events discrete. So then you get a combination. I think that is part of the patterns that are emerging from a macroeconomics situation.
So yeah, so we, if you look at Jay Forrester's book, Principles of Systems, one of his principles is you never have DT in a rate equation, in a flow equation. Well, guess what? We put those in our flow equations all the time because a lot of times when the last widget goes out of inventory, you snap it off the outflow, so you don't have negative inventory, right? So even though originally Jay thought a certain way, in practice in modern times, we use stuff like that all the time, Boolean logic at times, pipeline delays, infinite order delays, which are essentially discrete. So so where it makes sense, today in system dynamics, we stick to discrete time stuff in our models. But then you also get into, Jay addressed this a long time ago. He and, I'm trying to remember his name, the father of British system dynamics. Why is his name? Jeff Coyle. Jeff Coyle and Forrester used to have debates about what's the best way to model a power plant going online. And Jeff said it's discrete, it's off, and then it's on. Somebody pulls the switch and turns it on. Jay said, no, it's a continuous process. They were both right, they were both wrong. I mean, it's just two different ways of representing it, right? And the question, and Jay had his arguments as to why he felt the continuous time thing was better. Paying wages and salaries, in every 2 weeks or monthly or something, particularly if that's what the client or audience wants to see, and they're not going to believe your model if you don't do that, then you do it, right? You just got to do it mathematically correctly, right? As long as it's all good, then we're fine.
Oh, and I just want to note that we're over time for anyone who had a meeting after. Yes.
Yeah, and this might be a bit involved, but we could start. So thanks a lot. This has been fantastic. I have a great old friend, and he used to say quite often, so the dog caught the car, now what? So let's say we're incredibly successful and world of economists shift over to stock and flow economics. What, in some kind of practical sense, what would happen in government economics, in the world of economics?
All right, it's a great question. So here's how I would answer it. This is an answer, it's not the answer. But the way I got involved with the modern monetary theory people was I read a paper in 2002 by Randy Ray, and I just talked to Randy the other day. He's a good friend, known him 20 years. But when I first met him, I said, you wrote a paper in which you said it's really hard to teach modern monetary theory because people don't understand T accounts. And they would have these papers with all these T accounts where you're tracing bond purchases and check deposits and whatever through the commercial banking system, the treasury, the central bank system, and the household sector, for example. And I said to him, well, all of your assets and liabilities in your T accounts, we call them stocks in system dynamics. I can model that. And he said, come to me, come forward. And we built some early models and whatever. Now today, Stephanie Kelton is like the main guru in all this stuff. She's younger than, so she's kind of a disciple of his, I suppose you'd say. But she's good at bringing it to the average citizen. And the way that happened was she became, when Bernie Sanders ran for president the first time, she was his economics consultant or whatever. And she got him into believing modern monetary theory. And then he brought it into the Democratic Party. And all the stuff you see right now with the Green New Deal and all that, that's based on modern monetary theory, whether or not it's explicitly. So Keynes writes at the end of the general theory, and like the last paragraph, that, we're all slaves of some defunct economist, right? That economic ideas are so powerful. Well, I like Stephanie very much, but really, who's heard of her, right? They've heard of Paul Samuelson and Paul Krugman more recently and whatever. They don't really have heard of her. She is all the trillions of dollars of federal spending. That's Stephanie did that, right? So, and then she used to say, Mike, are you the guy who built that hydraulic model of our stuff? I know Randy better than I know her. So I think they could use these sorts of models, right, to look at that sort of thing. Jorgen Randers is looking at macro modeling. I've been helping him a little bit because he says, the barrier here is everybody wants to fix climate change and all this stuff, but they don't want to wreck the economy in so doing. That's the big barrier. So we need economic models to help us do that. You get into the Davos people and the Great Reset and all that stuff. So there are people, I think, who would listen if we got some models, and it doesn't have to be one macro model, the mother of all models that answers all questions, but industry level models, firm level models, macro models, regional models that all employ this perspective. And, if all of our models need to have a godly matrix to get the post-Keynesians on board, let's have godly matrices as a mandatory part of our models. Just making sure all the flows flow somewhere, and we're accounting for everything. And they also have some social accounting matrices or do a similar thing. So and if there's some data science things we should be using, some techniques there, why exclude them? If we can use some kind of forecasting contraption that economists like, or some data set that doesn't come from a Federal Reserve website, we should be doing that.
Thanks. Very nice.
Can I give a philosophical stroke theoretical perspective? The standard model assumes that maximum utility, that people know what they want, and then the goal is then to create as much of it as possible through the provision of goods or services. The alternative way that the polar opposite, if you like, would be to say that there was a given requirement, and then to deliver that at the lowest energy. In principle, I would assume that system dynamics should be able to demonstrate that.
Yeah, if you can precisely describe it, we can model it, right, and look at what it takes to get there, if it's possible to get there, and if so, what are the various routes and advantages and disadvantages. Absolutely.
Well,
Yeah,
back to your inductive
think,
and deductive, it's both sides in order to come up with a complete account.
Sure. I do think too, you mentioned the rational, Homo economicus there. I think the cutting edge, and by the way, I think gaming is an important part of convincing people for this stuff. Let them play engaging games. But I think putting relationships from psychology and behavioral economics that have been ratified in controlled experiments on human subjects into our models in a manner that would be found acceptable to a behavioral economist or a psychologist, and then simulating the implications of that stuff and looking at policies in light of the fact that people have a present bias, that people are loss averse, whatever the case may be. I think that has been unexplored. And it's not homo economicus, it's all this other nasty, difficult stuff that's going on in people's heads that is slowly being exposed, right? And putting that into our models. And in light of that, now do the policies change? What should we do? And I think that's a cutting edge of our field here. And this requires us to work with these people because you can't know everything about everything, right? So, we're over time. Should we call it a day and say enough of Radzicki and his like my students, no mas, enough.
Yes. Thank you everyone for attending. There were a lot of thank yous in the chat.
So